Now, when you fast forward to the Fed's intervention that started in late 2008, we also had, thank goodness, a gentleman like Ben Bernanke who spent his entire life studying financial crises, most particularly the mistakes that were made in 1937 here in the United States, raising taxes and raising interest rates simultaneously that put us into a second discrete depression, or the mistakes that were made in Japan from 1989 forward when their two markets peaked, property and stocks. On the last day of December in 1989, the Nikkei was at 40,000. It has since fallen to 9,000. Japan has been in recession half the time over the last 23 years, principally because of the policy mistakes that were made in the wake of the bursting of their twin bubbles. So Bernanke, intent on not repeating those mistakes, did more than flood the system with money. He engaged in this series of unconventional monetary policy measures that kept us from going into depression, that allowed us to turn the corner. And when you look at the current environment and analyze the economy today relative to the experiences of the 30s and Japan in the 90s and beyond, we're in much better shape than one would have thought if you kind of dialed the clock back to November of 2008, when we thought we were going into depression. When you look at this dispassionately and you ignore some of the gloom and doomers that you may see on occasion on CNBC as guests or elsewhere, you read their books about the impending disaster that the United States is going to experience, we've already been through it. It came and it went, and we are considerably stronger than one might have imagined 3 or 4 years ago. U.S. banks are overcapitalized to the tune of over $1 trillion. Now, again, deposits are liabilities, and I understand that, but they have $1.5 trillion on deposit at the Fed that's earning 25 basis points. U.S. corporations have roughly $2 trillion in cash on their balance sheets. They've never been stronger from a cash perspective. The gross domestic product of the United States at $16 trillion is above where it was at the last peak in 2007. Retail sales are above the last peak in 2007. Auto sales, which bottomed out at 9 million units in 2009, are now at 15 to 15.5 million units. It's about 1 million to 2 million shy of the record set in 2007, but 6 million above the trough that we saw 3 years ago. The U.S. economy is actually quite strong and quite resilient. We're seeing constant upgrades and changes in prior numbers. They're being upwardly revised. GDP in the last quarter, upwardly revised. And a whole host of numbers, including residential real estate, are getting considerably better. Year over year, housing prices are up 10% when you look at the national median, after having fallen 33% peak to trough across the United States. And yet we continue to hear this drumbeat of gloom and doom everywhere you look, as if we are ready for another crisis. And I'll address the fiscal cliff in just a moment, which we may have passed today for all intents and purposes as a risk. And I'll explain why in a few minutes. But the economy is in remarkably good shape. And I've spent much of the last 3 years talking about the resilience of the U.S. relative to the rest of the world. Europe is in a difficult situation. China is growing far more slowly than most people realize. India has been having some problems. Brazil also has not been growing as rapidly as people expected. And yet the U.S. has been a consistent, albeit slow grower over the last couple of years. Now, I do about 44, 45 of these events per year, and so I travel all over the country. There is not one city I've been to this year that looks like it's in recession, except for Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And that's more of a structural issue. I grew up for part of my life in Buffalo. Buffalo looks like it's in recession, but it's been in recession since 1971. So it's more of a city-specific issue for places like Buffalo, Cleveland, or Milwaukee than it is an economic issue when it comes to what we just experienced over the last couple of years. You go to the airport, every airplane is full. Now, people will argue that that's because they shrunk capacity, but the airports are also full. And so in the last 2 years, I have not been on an empty plane. Restaurants, and you all know this when you go into Manhattan, the place is just filled, whether you're going to Shake Shack or Per Se, as we were discussing earlier. I was at Del Frisco for lunch the other day. The manager there told me that they're having a record year. Del Frisco, for those of you who don't know the steakhouse that's on 50th and 6th, is the highest grossing restaurant, I believe, in the country. And they're having a record year. And when you go to Miami, condos are now being purchased. When you go to Phoenix, Las Vegas, I've been back, it's more like Las Vegas used to be, sans some of my other commentary. Los Angeles and San Francisco, quite busy. The economy is actually recovering and is far more healthy than most people would suggest. And what I've been talking about this year as well, more so than just looking at the United States on a relative basis compared to the rest of the world is that in absolute terms, we may very well be on the cusp of what I've been calling the dawn of the American decade, where because of this conventional energy boom that we're experiencing right now, because manufacturing is returning to the United States, because technological innovation is moving so quickly and the U.S. is a clear leader in that regard, we may be very well poised for a period of outperformance and more rapid growth than people realize than this type of double-dip recession that everyone keeps warning about. When you look at the energy situation in the United States, and it's astounding how this happened without anybody really recognizing it until recently. Dan Yergin, a friend of mine who writes about this stuff, has made elaborate notes in a variety of different publications about what's been happening over the last 3 and 4 years in our conventional energy markets. We are going to be, by 2020, as the International Energy Agency said the other day, the largest producer of crude oil in the world. We will overtake Saudi Arabia in a matter of 8 years. Our production is already at the highest level we've seen in the last 20 years. We are the largest producer of natural gas in the world, overtaking Russia last year. We are a net exporter of refined energy products as of last October for the first time in 62 years. We've created 600,000 jobs in the conventional energy sector, which is using new technologies to engage in hydraulic fracturing or fracking to extract this oil and gas. This is an extraordinary revolution that makes the U.S. Far more stable than one would have imagined for a variety of different reasons. We're going to be a net exporter of energy products over the next 5 to 10 years and be almost entirely self-sufficient when it comes to our energy needs. That's an enormous change. It's something that is much more like what we experienced in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, late 40s, 50s, and 60s, than we did in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Our consumption of imported crude has gone from 60% in 2005 to 45% today. That changes our balance of trade. It changes the current account deficit, changes the way we would finance future budget deficits if there were no agreement on reducing those deficits anytime soon. The use of natural gas makes the U.S., from a manufacturing perspective, that much more competitive. And when you look at the way in which wage differentials and currency differentials with China have narrowed, and the cost of energy being very high overseas, but now very low in the United States, there are a lot of manufacturers that are bringing home their operations. And I've even talked to a textile group a couple weeks ago out in LA, the Cotton Council. There are textile manufacturers that are contemplating coming home from China to make clothing. That was the low-cost area that went to Mexico and then went to China. And they're actually talking about coming back to the United States. Apple CEO Tim Cook, in an interview tonight with my colleague Brian Williams, pointed out that they're going to start manufacturing some computer parts here in the U.S., something we have not seen in 20 years. Most of that business has been offshored. That's about to change in a variety of different industries. And then technological innovation, something I was talking with my good friend Rabbi Mark Gelman, who's part of the IMUS Mafia going back some years. Technology here in the United States is far ahead of much of the rest of the world. Innovation happens here first and spreads outward. And that's been a big driver of growth in the United States. Where we're lagging, obviously, as a construction employment is still well below its peak because the housing industry hasn't fully recovered. But believe it or not, there is a shortage of new homes in the United States. Family formations that were deferred during the recession because kids coming out of college either moved home or delayed getting married and having children, that's all starting to reverse itself now as the economy recovers. And as people buy more new homes, we've seen housing starts jump rather dramatically in the last several months because we're playing catch up, and there's a lot of pent-up demand for housing and automobiles. Two big drivers, obviously, of economic growth in the United States. So things look pretty good. And residential real estate, as it turns, people will underestimate the impact that that's going to have. The trickle-down effect that you get from home building and car building is enormous in this economy, even though we're not necessarily the type of manufacturing powerhouse we once were. That is coming back. And that's a very good bit of news. And you don't hear this from the gloom and doomers. They're all talking about a currency crash. They're talking about the unsustainability of our budget deficits. They're talking about having a demographic crisis in the United States, which, by the way, when compared to other advanced nations, the U.S. does not have nearly the demographic problems of a China, believe it or not. Most countries in Europe, Japan, which is on the cusp of irreversible population decline. Over the next 20 years, Japan's going to lose 30 million people. They have as many centenarians as they have births every day in Japan. That's a very unbalanced population picture. Whereas we have the millennials following the baby boomers, and there's 100 million millennials larger than the baby boomer cohort coming into our economy. So from a demographic perspective, we're actually in reasonably good shape. So all of this to me adds up to be a much, much brighter picture, I think, than you're used to hearing about. And it grows frustrating because I've had no end of arguments on CNBC with the likes of a Peter Schiff or a Keith McCullough or a Harry Dent who thinks the Dow's going to 6,000 in the next 2 years and we're going to have a massive crisis. It's always possible. But when you look at these things, you have to look at what's probable. There's not a single market indicator that's telling us we're headed for a recession or a crisis of any kind. When you look at the types of things that I keep an eye on a daily basis, some of which are a little on the arcane side, credit spreads, international credit spreads, the behavior of financial markets generally, there are no warning signs like we got in 2007, 2008 of an impending crash. Not anywhere in the world, actually, at the moment, except for maybe some places like China. Even European interest rates, Greece, or Greek bonds, I should say, were yielding 43% 6 months ago, 8 months ago. They're down to 14% today. Now, I wish I'd been smart enough to purchase them at the height of that concern because that's an enormous capital gain. But when you look at all market-based indicators and you look at anecdotal evidence and the statistical data we get on the economy, we're in considerably better shape than most people would think. And my bet for next year, and again, this would be absent a complete abdication of responsibility on the part of our elected officials, which we all know is possible. We're probably going to grow 3 or 4% next year. That's contrary to what most people believe.